I'd like to move around a little bit, if that's okay. I'm going to talk about a book that I finished earlier this year called The Real Cyber War, A Political Economy of Internet Freedom. And in particular, I'm going to focus on one chapter that has a couple of titles. The title in the book is Nation States, Intranets, and Sovereignty. Another title that I've used in other iterations is Towards Information Sovereignty. And so really this is about understanding how governments are increasingly asserting governing authority on transnational information flows, and how those efforts are increasingly being seen as legitimate both by other state actors and by publics. A few things about the research that went into this, and I should mention the book's based on about 70 interviews with stakeholders and practitioners working on internet policy, either at national levels or international levels. I also sorted through about 6,000 FOIA documents, which I would not recommend anyone ever do, and I did archival work at the ITU in Geneva and at UNESCO in Paris, which is actually a lot more exciting than it sounds. But like I said, today I'm going to focus specifically on this question of information sovereignty and present a little bit of a theoretical background as to how I frame the question and why I think the question is interesting to a lot of folks in the field of international communication, but then look at 4 case studies in particular: Egypt, Iran, China, and the United States, to see how different governments are increasingly asserting authority on controlling information flows in very different ways, but at the end of the day, in a similar direction, analytical direction, and increasing the legitimacy of these types of behaviors. So a bit about the theoretical constructs involved here. The first one, of course, is nation states. I start here just to say, as a gentle reminder, that of course, there's a reason why there's a hyphen. The nation is separate from the state. The state is the legal construct that we're all very familiar with. The nation, of course, is a reference to the community that in an ideal situation is formed within the state and held together by shared stories, shared history, shared values, and that sort of thing. I say all of this, of course, because the nation state has had a rough decade. I love this quote from Alec Ross, he was a senior advisor at the Department of State and spearheaded quite a bit of their new technology programs, and the way he puts it, the 21st century is a terrible time to be a control freak, right? It's hard to control things when technologies are enabling so many new types of communication, and in so doing, new types of behaviors. And so, across the world, I mean, I think the Arab Spring is sort of the perfect example of this. Governments struggling to establish legitimacy, and citizens also are demanding more from their governments at the same time. And we're seeing it not just in the Middle East, but of course throughout the world. The Occupy Wall Street movement is a good example of this as well. The second construct I want to mention is intranets. Intranets, and this is, of course, juxtaposed to internets, or internet. Intranets is a reference to a network that is closed off in some capacity, or there are additional rules applied to it, but it eventually typically does make its way to the internet. A good example of an intranet, of course, is the network here at Penn, right? So Penn has its own intranet that once you establish your credentials, you sign in, it allows you to access the World Wide Web, which is the internet, but only based on the rules that you agree to. And so intranets are popping up around the world at universities, in countries, and these are additional layers on top of the internet that have usually new requirements like verifying your identity or restricting your ability to access particular parts of the World Wide Web. I mentioned intranets and kind of put it in the broader context of how it connects to the World Wide Web, because technology, of course, has a historical relationship in terms of how power is constituted and legitimated. And in particular, as I'm sure most people in this room are familiar with, Benedict Anderson's theory of the imagined community. Anderson traced the history of the invention of the printing press and made a compelling case that the printing press allowed for the creation of local, or the maturing of local languages throughout Europe, which then allowed greater sharing of history among smaller communities, and it took the monopoly of knowledge away from Latin speakers in the church and placed it more in local communities. This shift in power relations allowed for the rise of the nation-state system, so on and so forth. More recently, we've had other folks argue that newer technologies are reshaping power relations as well. And so I've got an image of radio liberation, a classic case study of public diplomacy in the 20th century, but as a reference really to how radio was used to reshape geopolitics in the 20th century, especially during World War I, World War II, and during the Cold War. I've got some images of CNN and Al Jazeera up there as well. Similarly, communication scholars have pointed at CNN and Al Jazeera to argue that these media organizations are reshaping international relations by spotlighting particular types of political controversies and focusing the public's attention on these issues to try to then get states to change their policies. Long history of media technologies shaping politics or being involved in politics. And then finally, I have an internet image to kind of point towards all the different speculation about how the internet may democratize the world. There have been quite a few scholars who have pointed to the possibilities there. One thing about this construct I want to mention is a concept Harold Innis came up with in 1951. He's a Canadian communication scholar. He's one of my favorites. One of my favorite Canadians and one of my favorite communication scholars. And he has this idea of the bias of technology. And so in his history of communication technologies, he looked at how different ways of communicating, different technologies of communicating, had specific biases that privileged particular types of power relations or particular political actors. And what he calls for, sort of ambiguously, but what he does call for in his work is that when new technologies emerge, as scholars, we look for the biases embedded within those technologies and then try to decipher which actors will most likely benefit from those biases. Okay? The final theoretical construct I'll mention, of course, is sovereignty, a term we're all very familiar with, a term that Monroe used in his last book. And so it's of course an important term in international communication. And I'm referring here to the idea that a government has the legitimate authority to govern within a particular geographic territory. Some people describe it as the expectation that your laws will be followed by the citizens of that particular territory. And sovereignty, of course, is the bedrock of the international system. And when I say that, it's an easy thing to say, but if you think about it, it truly is a foundational principle for how international relations operates and how states operate around each other. It is the most important building block to explain current events in international politics today. And the three of these ideas, three of these constructs, of course, come together with a central question of, is the internet or our new media technologies weakening or strengthening the concept of sovereignty as it relates to the nation state? And we've seen this question approached by quite a few scholars. There's kind of an ongoing debate as to whether or not the internet's going to democratize the world or whether or not it's going to enable surveillance. And this is my attempt to intervene into this debate and focus on some empirical case studies and to draw some conclusions that may not be the most popular conclusions, but certainly need to be discussed with some greater depth. So, when I started thinking about this question, I said, if I were a government and there were all these new technologies enabling all sorts of new communication, I would regulate, right? If you were in power and you wanted to hold on to your power, it's a pretty simple equation. So then I asked myself, well, what theories help explain why governments aren't simply just controlling all of the media communication technologies out there? And there are two in particular that are helpful for thinking this through. One is my favorite named theory in the world, cute cat theory. Has anyone ever heard of cute cat theory? Excellent. So this was developed by Ethan Zuckerman while he was at Harvard in, I think, 2005, 2006. And the idea was that controlling the internet or censoring the internet was exceptionally difficult for governments because if you try to control access to political content, you have to shut down the entire portal that's hosting that content. And if you do that, then you're restricting people's access to cute cat videos. Because people use YouTube not just for political communication, but also for pure entertainment and any number of things. And so the fact that political messaging depends on the same portals that entertainment messaging depend on make it very difficult for states to filter this content or censor this content, because if they do, they're going to upset a greater part of the citizenry than they would if they just went after the political content. Okay, great theory, beautifully named, makes a lot of sense. Cute cat theory didn't quite realize, but there's another theory that sort of explained this called the conservative's dilemma, developed by Asa Briggs. And he puts it in a much more elegant way. He says governments, when faced with political dissent, have four options. The first one is propaganda, right? You try to convince them that they're wrong. The second one is censorship. You try to shut them up by not letting them communicate effectively with the rest of society. The third one is total information control, sort of a combination of option A and option B, propaganda and shutting them up. And the fourth one is just violence. You end the messaging altogether. And what Briggs says, the reason why it's a conservative's dilemma is that new technologies, new media technologies, make it exceptionally difficult for governments to effectively implement any of those four strategies. So propaganda is less likely to be taken serious when people have access to all sorts of information. Censorship becomes really difficult when there are more ways to get messages out. Total information control not only is more difficult from a technical perspective, but because economies are so intertwined with new media technology, it's really difficult just to shut down access to whole-scale, large-scale networks. So governments will be hesitant to do that. And of course, violence, because it can be easily recorded and then shared around the world, is less and less of an effective strategy because it risks opening up the regime to a serious challenge in terms of legitimacy. Okay, so these are the two theories that I think could convincingly argue that there are lots of reasons why states will not simply just regulate or try to assert information sovereignty in the news space. The problem with both these theories, and this becomes readily apparent when we start working through the case studies, is they presume that citizens know that they're missing out on something. So cute cat theory presumes that citizens know that there are cute cats out there and that they want those cute cat videos. Okay? The conservative's dilemma presumes that people understand the government's message is propaganda because they have access to other content that questions the credibility or the legitimacy of that government propaganda. And those presumptions made sense for the vast majority of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. But what we're starting to see now is the effective development of intranets within states such that citizens of a country like China don't need to look outside of the Chinese internet for cute cat videos. They don't need to look outside of the internet in China for a plurality of political perspectives. And the result of that is they don't necessarily feel the need for international content to compare and to challenge their government's messaging or local messaging. So the theories don't necessarily match up with the empirical conditions we're looking at today. Then we proceed to look at some case studies to try to figure out exactly how relevant these theories are today, and if they're not relevant, what types of new theoretical constructs may be helpful in thinking through these questions moving forward. Any questions so far? Okay, let's go to Egypt. It's a beautiful place. If you've never been, quite nice. As you all are very familiar, in 2011, a revolution started in Cairo after a revolution in Tunisia, or protests in Tunisia, rather. And on January 28th, does anyone know what happened on January 28th? Late, I guess, on January 27th?
Internet shut down?
Perfect. So President Mubarak was getting tired of these pesky protesters. He says, I'm tired of you guys. And so he picks up the phone, issues the equivalent of an executive order shutting down the internet in Egypt. And this is a chart that shows what happened when he issued that decree. 93% of connectivity was severed. All the major internet service providers stopped providing service to Egyptian citizens. The only connectivity that remained was that of the government's connectivity. The reason why this is an interesting case study is Egypt had a very sophisticated internet infrastructure. 8 international undersea cables go through Egyptian territory. The vast majority of internet connections that go from Europe to Asia or Asia to Europe go through Egypt's territory. So there's lots and lots of ways to connect to the internet. But despite that, with just one simple decree, all of those cables were severed from the domestic internet infrastructure, and the 13 internet service providers, half of which were foreign-owned, all agreed to implement the new decree. No one was willing to go against the order, in large part because of a risk that if they didn't follow the rules, they would no longer be allowed to operate in Egypt. So I go through some detail here. It's an interesting case study for me because for a long time there was an argument that was unquestioned that states simply couldn't shut down the internet. They simply could not regulate the internet effectively. There's too much connectivity, too many ways to connect to the World Wide Web. And the case of Egypt is sort of a startling counterfactual to show how easy it is for even unsophisticated government with not much legitimacy to shut down all connectivity, despite the fact that the infrastructure there was robust. I also like this case study because it certainly validates, here's a map of the major undersea cables that all flow through Egypt. I mention this case study for a second reason, and that is it validates Briggs' conservative dilemma theory. After shutting the internet down for 5 days, President Mubarak had absolutely no credibility, and in reality what had happened is the majority of Egyptians had not been protesting. They'd been in their homes, but when they could no longer surf the web or use their cell phones, they went on their porches, or the Egyptian equivalent of a porch, and talked to their neighbors, and they became more upset, and more people protested as a result. And so an effort at total information control backfired just as the theory would have predicted, and of course, as we all know, President Mubarak was removed from power. So an interesting case study here. The technical capacity to censor and control certainly exists, even in amongst unsophisticated governments. At the same time, there are social and political consequences to that kind of heavy-handed effort. And of course, a reminder of what happened to President Mubarak. So from there, we go to Iran, which is another interesting case study, but it's I call it a fuzzy case study because it's not entirely clear what lessons can be taken from here, but I'll do my best, and hopefully it makes some sense, and maybe it'll trigger some questions, and then you can help me figure this out. So Iran is, of course, incredibly keen on developing a robust national internet technology industry base. This is in large part, of course, a reaction to American foreign policy. As I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in 2009, after the second election of President Ahmadinejad, there were large-scale protests in Tehran and throughout the country, and the U.S. government, among others, argued that Twitter was crucial to the continuation of these protests, and that claim ended up being false. But in order to, what the State Department thought was help the protesters communicate with each other, the State Department went to Twitter and said, please don't shut down your service like you planned for maintenance one morning, because your service is crucial for the protesters in Iran to communicate and coordinate. Now, the Iranian government, of course, they read newspapers, and they saw this and they said, here is, direct evidence from the horse's mouth that the technology companies are doing the work of the State Department. They're all in cahoots, they're all coordinating. And the reason why this is significant is it gave the Iranian government legitimacy when they argued that Western technology companies were doing the work of the American government. Regardless of if there's any truth to that claim, it actually made sense to quite a few Iranians. This debate, of course, was magnified with news of the Stuxnet virus, which was developed by the National Security Agency and the Israeli government and installed on the Iranian nuclear system through a USB device, which then slowed down their nuclear development process quite a bit. These and some other controversies increased skepticism among Iranians, and in particular the Iranian government, as it relates to the Western internet and Western internet companies and technologies. So as a result, the Iranians have been developing what they call the National Internet Infrastructure, or what some have described as a Hillel Internet. Have you all heard of this term, Hillel Internet? I love it so much. Hillel, of course, referring to the Islamic idea of purity and holiness. And so the idea is they're developing a locally produced and controlled intranet that will serve Iranian needs better than the internet, and importantly, the way they plan on convincing Iranians to use the intranet is it will be 60 to 75 times faster than any access to the World Wide Web. So if you actually want to watch a video, the only way to access that video and not have to sit there and wait for it to load for 30 minutes is to use the Hillel network. Now, Americans and other Western governments are trying to help Iranian citizens access the global internet through circumvention technologies, and they are increasingly utilized by a number of Iranians. And so the Iranian government, of course, is now backing off a little bit from the Hillel network in an effort to convince the Iranians that they're not going to sever their connections to the World Wide Web, and they are going to develop a better infrastructure so that connectivity speeds will increase, and so on and so forth. But we do see evidence that the Iranian government is increasing its monitoring of all internet connectivity, and that it, in particular, is starting to require all government officials, all government employees, all teachers, all financial institutions to use Iranian-based security software, Iranian-based email addresses, and taking a cue from China, which I'll talk about in just a minute, they're subsidizing and in some ways requiring the development of a local internet industry, ideally so that Iranians would then go to the local industry and use local services as opposed to Western services. In addition to that, it's very likely that they'll continue to censor access to Western websites, 30% of which right now are currently inaccessible in Iran. What's interesting about the Iranian case study, and kind of hard for me to think through, is just how careful of a balancing act the Iranian government seems to be keen on walking. They seem very sensitive to being perceived as being too heavy-handed, and keep on, when news of the Hillel network came out, for example, they walked it back and said, no, we're not going to do that, you'll have plenty of access. And it seems like they're very concerned about their legitimacy and exactly what levels of control they see as feasible in that situation is I think, an open question at this point. China, of course, is the role model of censorship. And when I say censorship, I should actually use a very different word. I mean control. And the Chinese have, in a lot of ways, perfected the different control mechanisms as it relates to the internet. Certain websites are entirely blocked, that's for sure. Certain terms cannot be searched through search engines, that's for sure too. But this kind of heavy-handed censorship is actually not the norm, and in fact is relatively limited compared to Iran, for example. But where China's been really effective has been in more subtle ways of control. One way, for example, of course, is the requirement that all internet users register with an actual and provable identity. So there is no anonymous browsing in China unless you can use and implement sophisticated anonymizing software. This then, of course, creates a regime of self-censorship, because if you know how easy it is to be tracked down, you're less likely to say anything that's controversial. In addition to that, they have subsidized and supported the development of a robust Chinese internet industry that many folks describe as a copycat industry. And for every major Western internet service, Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter, Pinterest, a copycat emerges within China that is very similar, but tailors the service to meet kind of specific Chinese cultural needs. And a lot of folks have made the argument that the copycats are actually much superior services because they can learn from the mistakes and have a much better sense of the Chinese internet consumer. The result of this is that even if and even when Chinese netizens have access to Western internet services like Google, like Facebook, they prefer not to use them. They prefer to use the local version. And I'll connect this back to cute cat theory. If you can watch American cats, or you can watch Chinese cats, and you're a Chinese citizen, you're more likely to choose the Chinese cats. And so there's a cultural incentive, cultural inertia to stick with the local industries, which have now become a powerful force in the global economy. I'm sure y'all have heard of Alibaba, which is probably the most important internet actor in economic terms today. The Chinese internet industry is second only to the United States, and the difference between the two is actually quite small. Now, I mention all of this because each of these internet private sector actors are, of course, tightly controlled by the government, and they are required to implement all the different government regulations that decrease the ability for citizens to use the internet for dissent, and in particular for organizing protests. What most folks have found is that it's actually allowed to express dissent in a lot of ways online in China. That's not the biggest concern of the Chinese government, but any call to actually organize or protest policies is heavily scrutinized and restricted and punished. And that's an important distinction because this allows the Chinese government to use the internet as a barometer for public opinion while preventing it from becoming a tool for actually organizing the types of protests we saw in Tunis and Cairo and Damascus. I'm sure you all are familiar with the 50-cent army, which is a reference to the equivalent amount of money that the Chinese government pays its netizens if they post a pro-government comment on a blog or on a story. And the effort here, of course, is to counter any dissent that citizens are posting online with the government opinion, but it seems like it's authentic because it's not a government spokesperson, but rather it's a Chinese citizen who just happens to get money from the Chinese government as a result. The last estimate on the 50-cent army was that it was 3 million people strong, which is quite a few commenters. What surprises me mostly about China, and the reason why I think it's a fascinating case study, is a 2012 Pew study that interviewed Chinese citizens that were traveling abroad on vacation found that 86% of these citizens supported the existing level of government control or supported increased government control of the internet in China. So let's just think about this for a second. These are probably educated if they're traveling abroad, probably financially well off. So we're talking about usually a sophisticated audience of Chinese citizens. And it's outside of the physical jurisdiction of China, which means the kind of typical concern about the state spying on the answers to the surveys would be lessened. And this group, 86% of them supported the current level or greater control of the internet in China. So it's easy for, I think, Americans and American commentators to look at China and say, it's going to change, people want more freedom, they're going to demand it, the Chinese government's going to have to give in. But the statistics on this question don't support that argument, and in fact support a very different argument. The last case study I want to talk about, save the best for last, of course, the United States. I should mention that I wrote this chapter about 6 months before the Snowden revelations, and I'm really actually more focused on how states are controlling the internet domestically and not necessarily international surveillance or international controls. And so the NSA revelations obviously validated quite a few things that I had hypothesized. But what was interesting for me is just how obvious the control mechanisms were before the Snowden revelations came to light. And so this started, of course, after 9/11. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the ongoing court case. A former AT&T employee has whistleblown and claims to have physically seen the evidence of an NSA spy box based on the Einstein 2 and Einstein 3 technology that was inserted in a major telecommunications hub in San Francisco, owned and operated by AT&T, which allowed the NSA then to listen in on the vast majority of phone calls made by Americans and monitor search queries and emails as well. Again, this is back in 2002, 2003. That's where things begin. But as we've learned from the Snowden revelations, the NSA, of course, has a robust surveillance team and has support from numerous countries that enable it to monitor what is going on the internet around the world in real time in a lot of situations. What's more interesting for me than the NSA revelations is a move by the NSA, and again, this is before Snowden, to try to increase the security of the internet and the security of intranets of American private sector companies by building them into government internet systems. And so the largest intranet in the world is called NIPRNet, N-I-P-R-N-E-T. And it is the entirely locked down, relatively secure network that the government uses to communicate with one another. This is how the FBI and Department of Homeland Security exchange files and emails. And they use NIPRNet to test and implement hyper-secure software and protocols to try to make it the most secure and uncrackable network in the world. And in congressional testimony in 2011, NSA former chief Keith Alexander made a couple of arguments that were really interesting to me. He told Congress that the internet was not secure and that this was a problem for our economy because the private sector depends on an effective internet for the vast majority of its operations. And if it isn't secure, that whole private sector is at risk. But the solution he proposed was not the one that I think anyone in this room would foresee. He said, the lack of security on the public internet is a good thing for us. We have a secure intranet that we've been developing, NIPRNet, and the worse it gets on the public internet, we called it the wild, wild west, the more likely corporations would come to the government and ask if they could utilize the government's hypersecure intranet to guarantee their security. He described the process unfolding as basically incentivizing companies coming onto the government network to avoid the insecurity of the public network. It was a very interesting series of arguments. And in particular, he said, economically crucial industries are the first ones that will be asked to join this. And he listed a couple. The one that's most important to me and probably to you is, of course, the telecommunications industry, which, if it starts to rely on a hyper-secure government-controlled network, then, of course, the vast majority of our communications are also dependent on that network and can be monitored and archived. I'm going to tell one more anecdote about the United States that I find really interesting, and it's sort of a good plug for the book. Has anyone here heard of In-Q-Tel? No, have you heard of In-Q-Tel? Yeah. You have? Yeah? Yeah. Cool. That's good. I'm going to talk about it anyways, if it's okay. It was launched in 2001 by the CIA, and it is a angel investor. It's a truly remarkable, innovative program for the government, but Congress allocated about $35 million each year to the CIA explicitly to invest in startup technology companies, mostly based in Silicon Valley, who are working on technologies that are relevant to the defense and intelligence communities. And the idea was technology, of course, is going to transform the ways in which we do intelligence gathering and defense, but the private sector may not develop the technologies in ways that are most useful or beneficial to the US government. And so we need to have the only thing that matters in making these decisions, of course, is investment dollars. So we need to be able to play and compete in the investment game to make sure these companies are developing technologies that are productive for our needs as well. It's been wildly successful. They estimate that for every $1 million In-Q-Tel invests in a company, they're able to leverage that for $20 additional million from other parts of the investment community because they see it as a sign of stability and longevity. And there's one investment that is especially interesting. Has anyone ever heard of Keyhole Inc.? Yes, excellent. Keyhole Inc. is Google Maps. It is Google Earth. It is it was the company that developed the foundation for Google's mapping technology. And so In-Q-Tel was an early heavy investor in Keyhole, as was Google. And when Google acquired Keyhole, the CIA actually was then owning stock in Google, and there was a bit of a news controversy surrounding that. But what's interesting to me here is the government invested in the company to create mapping technology that's now owned by Google that we all use probably on a daily basis, as does the military. And in fact, the military uses the same platform. It's an advanced version of it, but to schedule drone strikes and so on and so forth. And they pay a hefty annual sum to Google to be able to access that platform, even though they were one of the first investors in it. So I tell all of this to point at the tight relationship between the industry and the technology sector in Silicon Valley, and how that relationship shapes the technologies we're using. I think needs a lot more scrutiny among scholars. So with those 4 case studies in mind, I want to conclude with a kind of a historical anecdote. In the 16th and 17th centuries, traders came up with a body of law called Lex Mercatoria. I'm not saying that right, Monroe. Do you know how to say it?
Not sure it's not
Mercatoria?
Mercatoria. I can't remember.
It's a Latin term.
Yeah.
It was a
Law of merchants.
law of merchants. It's a Latin term that refers to the law of merchants. These are legal doctrines that were developed bottom up by traders to govern commercial transactions because there was a lack of law at the state level. And lots of theorists have pointed to this bottom up deliberative process of developing laws and rules as sort of an ideal way in which governance can take place. And it's a great kind of history lesson and really interesting. But what people often forget to talk about, and there's an analogy here to internet laws, is that as soon as governments realized how important trade was to the global economy and the risk that this power had on decreasing the legitimacy of their ability to govern, they co-opted the norms. They implemented them as official state doctrine and, of course, adapted them to suit their needs and to increase their legitimacy. And I think this is exactly what we're seeing happen when it comes to internet laws. At the beginning, it was a bottom-up process, and stakeholders and specialists developed the norms that constitute the laws of the internet. But as governments realize how important this technology and infrastructure is for both political and economic reasons, they've co-opted those institutions. They're going to keep the best parts of those laws, but of course insert elements that guarantee their strength and their survival. So with that, I open it up for questions.
Well, I think it's really very, very interesting, fascinating. I guess one thing I might add is that there have been some new developments in recent years since the new leadership came into power. That the idea of the 50-cent party it sort of was an earlier practice, and now it's becoming there are more sophisticated ways of censoring, controlling the internet. And one of the new initiatives, I think, is more of a kind of ideological education or cultural education or campaign, you might say, which, for instance, emphasizes a lot about the social ills caused by internet rumors, right? The importance of the ethics of self-discipline, self-regulation, and so in general, I think this new leadership, Xi Jinping came into office at the end of 2012. I think they are trying to introduce some new approaches to the management of the Chinese internet, and some of these are more sophisticated than what we know have been in place. And it will be a sort of a very interesting new kind of area for researchers. Us, a few of our students are very interested. Actually, Tim might add, there's another interesting angle about how the internet firms themselves, businesses are very much into the censorship business. It's a business,
Yeah. So if I can comment, one of the things I forgot that I skipped over that I think is interesting about China is the Green Dam controversy. So in 2010, the government had started to implement a requirement that a Green Dam hardware and software be installed on all computers sold in China. And this, as far as I understand it, would basically enable real-time monitoring and archiving of every single keystroke and image that appeared on a Chinese computer. And if I'm the government, this is awesome. Right? This is exactly total information control, and it sounds great. But what surprised me is they backed off fairly quickly, actually. And they got a lot of pushback from technology companies and from users, and they decided to revoke the requirement and stick with, I think, more subtle and nuanced approaches. And so when I highlight the Chinese effort as effective, I think it's because they've seen how they have to balance the efforts at control, and they understand that top-heavy, heavy-handed efforts like requiring real-time monitoring go too far, and more subtle ideological campaigns are actually a much more effective way of proceeding and maintaining their legitimacy. Other questions? Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I think it was very interesting. I'm a little troubled about how you're using intranets as a metaphor rather than an actual technical approach.
Yeah, that's good.
I think the way I would approach that first, the internet's a network of networks. So it's not like an intranet is a network on top overlaid on this. It's more the World Wide Web could be described as a cultural exchange or protocol on top of the internet. Rather, intranets would then be IP-based localized networks on the edges of networks.
Yeah, I think it's a absolutely fair criticism, and that's why I've moved away from describing this chapter as nation states, intranets, and sovereignty, and more towards information sovereignty title, because I think you're right. There are some. It doesn't really add any analysis.
But I think it can. I can find interesting nuance when you have technical level or network layer controls versus cultural controls.
Sure.
So when you're presenting the idea of nation state, you're distinguishing in your theoretical approach that there is the authority construct of the state. There's also the cultural identity of a nation.
Yeah.
So a nation like Iran, for example, might do a number of different centralized controls at the network layer, such as restricting all home access to 128 kilobits per second, which is too slow for any cultural exchange or meaningful cultural exchange.
Sure.
And then on top of that, you have different types of regulatory approaches to control how culture and communications takes place. You might be able to organize across the Iranian internet to say, make discussions about climbers lost in the Himalayas or other non-political engagements.
Yeah.
So you create that space of legitimized cultural content or communications while restricting political constructs.
Yeah.
And I think if you want to use internet as an analytical tool, distinguishing between how states are controlling the network layer approach or applying territory to networks versus territory to content and communications would allow a different approach.
That's a great idea. I wish I would have done that. That's a really good idea. I think it's a great way to think through all the different control mechanisms and how they are distinct analytically, but it can be equally powerful, both culturally and technically.
But I think it also avoids blurring lines
Yeah,
between
a much more analytically clear approach. I like that a lot.
whether a state actually has its sophistication to do national technical control mechanisms, or are they perhaps doing something where they're trying to vilify use of certain uses of communication, such as receiving Azerbaijan or other types of countries that might be targeting intermediaries, while not having network layer censorship mechanisms.
It also allows you to look at how certain technical controls may influence cultural controls. And so you can actually start to categorize states that have similar technical controls, and then you can look for similarities or dissimilarities in the cultural controls and see if there's a relationship there. It'd be a great article. We should write it.
Well, let's start.
So I have a question about public opinion. We're thinking a lot about whether it's important to do public opinion polls with attitude towards internet principle. It's called internet principle. What's the utility of taking public opinion polls? I think your Chinese example demonstrated some of the good parts and bad parts. So how can one think about the kind of surveys that are useful? What are they useful for? Why do we want to take them? What's the point? That's the question we're sort of wrestling with.
I think it's a great question. It really depends on the questions you ask in the survey. So, a typical survey about support for internet control or internet policy may not necessarily include questions about how people feel about copyright protections online. But that is an example of control policy. So I think you have to be careful about how the question is actually characterized.
It could relate to what Lovina is saying about maybe we have a kind of cultural effort to ideologically support the idea of freedom, and we're measuring how successful we are at creating a kind of public reaction to international demand. And are there particular areas of the data
I think it's the survey is interesting because in a sense it's like, well, it's a surprise, right? That a lot of people in China are supportive of internet control. But I didn't read what kind of survey questions they asked, because certainly parents are very supportive of controlling access of their children to porn sites and all. They're all factors. And then internet addiction is a huge social problem. Parents who are very worried about their kids' prospects of going to a college and so on, always concerned about limiting their time to go on the internet, whatever possible, whatever means possible. So it will be helpful to get a sense of the kind of again, breaking down the control, what kind of contents are controlled and what kind of contents are parents in favor of controlling.
Just adding to this, or a different angle, I think that especially the right to freedom of expression, of course, is always a minority right. It's only put to a test when there is a minority that voices an opinion that does not belong to the mainstream. So if all speech would be favorably received by the majority, then we won't need the right to freedom of expression. That's never put to a test. So I doubt that surveys on the meaningfulness of the right to freedom of expression and the majorities there are a tool that makes sense somehow, because it's always the minority, it's always the contested, the shocking, disturbing content that is protected under the right to freedom of expression, not the mainstream content.
I think the effective surveys I've seen on this are specific questions about under what conditions can freedom of expression be limited. Because in principle, everyone agrees with freedom of expression. It's the easiest thing among the easiest things. I support democracy and freedom of expression. But then in practice, when you're given examples, it can be difficult. And so, Robert, it seems like it depends on the purpose of the program, but if an effective survey would actually be trying to figure out why people are afraid of greater internet freedom in countries like China. What is it that they're most concerned about? Because then theoretically you could develop programs to decrease those concerns.
Well, it's interesting if you have an interventionist strategy, but it's like a diagnostic thing. People will favor, if you say X or Y to Z, people will favor it to change your message.
Just a different tack. I was thinking about the real name policies. I mean, we're all very concerned when a country implements a real name policy, but isn't it just a cultural difference? Because, I mean, for example, the US doesn't need a real name policy because Facebook demands a real name policy. Sweden doesn't demand a real name policy because if you have an IP address, well, I can track it to your real name.
Yeah.
So I sometimes think we overplay the idea, oh my God, you have to identify yourself to go on the internet. And in other countries like Sweden, fantastic, you don't. But in reality, you already have. Yeah. So I wonder sometimes if it's an equal measure just by different means.
So in a newer iteration of this chapter, I actually look at Denmark's copyright policies as another example. And so similar to, it sounds like what you just stated, there's a very quick way for, if any copyright violation is spotted with automated deep packet inspection technology, they can figure out the name, address, and
within hours,
really fast.
Yeah.
And that is a control mechanism. So I think you're right that they're actually, it's unfair to point at certain countries unless we have a holistic understanding of how easy that is in lots of contexts. At the same time, I think we don't talk about the importance of protecting anonymous speech nearly enough when it comes to these issues. I think way too often discussions about privacy were sort of sidetracked by emphasizing how mean people can be online when they're anonymous, and how that's really not productive. And something I spent a lot of time on in the concluding chapter is reviewing just how important anonymous speech, or protections for anonymous speech, have been in developing a democratic society in the United States, but also abroad, and how those protections really need to be applied online. So I agree with you. I also think it highlights the importance of anonymous speech.
Yes, I mean, anonymous speech is one of the problems. I also think it's almost more fair to demand a real name policy, because you're really saying, we are looking at you. Well, if you ask the average citizen of Denmark or Sweden, they won't know they're being looked at, even though they are being looked at.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always careful. It's a very, if you got some faith in the rule of law system and the checks and balances, then I think it's okay to start thinking about that. But in the vast majority of countries, that simply is not something people have trusted.
I would just add, you can get off a plane in Shanghai and with cash and no ID buy data, unlimited data SIM card, and travel the country using your private VPN for a week. And that's not a problem at all. So I'm not exactly 100% sure there is a completely implemented real name policy anywhere, because a lot of that it would impair commerce, which would impair profit. So I don't actually think anywhere in the world has an actual functioning real name policy.
But only back to the problem you started with, then, that you have to know that that you have to what you don't know, or you have to know that you're trying to avoid something.
You just have to walk up with a handful of cash and do your SIM card at the airport. If you don't mind getting ripped off, but it's not like a back alley deal. You just walk up to the window. Yeah.
So-
Elena, do you want to say a word about Russia and react to this discussion? Russian background.
Actually, I don't research much internal policy, and mostly what I research is foreign policy and international relations in the field. But I strongly believe that there is like a geopolitics of the internet. At first, everyone thought that it will be a space out of state control, just free area of mind. But now we see that states are exerting more and more control. It's like a general trend. But what I mentioned, you were discussing like democracy and surveillance and sovereign control and not extra sovereign control. But I strongly believe that, these are not opposed ideas. Like sovereignty can be with democracy and with surveillance. So, these are not opposed. These are not that much opposed ideas.
So
Just to
surveillance scares me a little bit more than sovereignty and democracy coexist. And I think they actually need each other to be a healthy society.
Yeah, and the United States seem to be a very sovereign state on the internet. Very misplanned.
Very sovereign, I like that. Extra sovereign. I agree. I just want to make one comment on the Chinese VPN. So absolutely true, and I love these anecdotes. But what I always go back to are, the surveys that actually show how many people are using VPNs in China, and it's incredibly.
That was the minor point. I was just saying that you don't need a real name registration to get online.
It's a point well taken. But it's amazing how the small hassle of figuring out how to use a VPN and then using it on a routine basis really stops people. The people just don't do it nearly as much as I think I would assume if I hadn't done some research on it.
Yeah, but I don't think they block a lot of it on purpose. I think they let a lot of it through because it's economic benefit, which is kind of the political economy aspect of it. There's a lot more blocking to outside stuff they could do, but it would impact people connecting to businesses and business people in the United States traveling abroad. So, I think because it's a control issue, I think they give up control to make money. Right?
Yeah, but we're in agreement.
Yeah.
Coming back to the anonymous speech on the internet, did you look into IPv6 as the new domain name system? I'm always wondering what that means for anonymous speech on the internet and whether that changes the whole game because you get this lifetime IPv6 address and you be identified wherever you go with your whatever device you have. Did you look at this and did you have
I
any
didn't realize
insights there?
IPv6 was necessarily a static IP address. Is that?
Yeah, I don't know either for sure, but that apparently seems to be part of the discussion that it might lead to static IP addresses for singular devices at least.
Yeah, so
Not for persons but devices.
I talked to the IETF folks that sort of spearheaded the IPv6 effort. A lot of letters strung together. From talking to them, my understanding is that the folks that control the network decide if the IPv6 IP address is static, it's randomized, and if it's between there, how often it is randomized. And so it's actually puts the power in the hands of Comcast if we're here in Philadelphia, Time Warner. And so I thought about it a little bit, but I think there's probably more to it than what I talk about. But it's worth digging into a little bit.
I like that you brought up Zuckerman's theory. I think the QCAT theory is a very meta internet theory in that it's like the internet or internet content very easily digestible and illustrates an interesting point, which is there's things people do online and want to do online outside of political communication. But from the political economy aspect, I think the economic advantages to countries of communications and the cost of complete disconnection is also an important piece. And so when we look at Egypt, the OECD estimated they were losing 3 to 4% of the national GDP daily during the shutdown.
$18 million a day or something crazy.
Right, so 90 billion total. And resultingly, we haven't seen another complete shutdown of the internet except for a couple of hiccups in Syria, one of which we found out was the NSA accidentally bunking out some routers and bricking them. So the curious thing is, with that in mind, and this idea of sovereignty, how do you approach the idea of countries maintaining economic participation and economic interdependence while maintaining national cultural identity?
Yeah. That's the question. You know, I think the first barrier, the first hurdle I wanted to conquer here was just to show how easy the technical aspect of control was. And that's, I think, pretty well established these days. But the main limitation now is not the technical issues. It is the economic issues, and to a lesser extent the political issues. But I would hypothesize that is Iran's main concern as to why they're afraid to go too far down the Hillel internet road, because it has commercial implications. And at the end of the day, the economy has to be growing and stable for politics to be stable. But I don't have much of a clear answer on that. We should write a second paper.
Well, just one data point on Iran. I think it's 70% of young Iranians, 18 to 25, are using VPNs and proxies.
Yeah.
So,
which is not what's happening in China, but in Iran for sure.
so you have essentially the approach to internet control in Iran is a moral panic, and at this point, unsubstantiated.
No, that came out like last week, right? Yeah, I saw that.
Well, I want to thank you, Shawn, for this wonderful discussion. We've learned all this sort of constants, levels of expertise. Thank you very much. Thank you, Shawn.
Thank you for your time.